Next slide. I'll start with just a couple definitions, get us moving here. The first is grid interactive efficient building, GEBS by another name, and at least we're using the U.S. Department of Energy Building Technologies Office definition here for today and for this effort, which is an energy efficient building with smart technologies characterized by active use of demand energy resources and intelligent controls to optimize building energy use for a wide range of issues. You can look at that as we go forward. And then grid modernization, modern grid has to improve reliability for everyday ops, enhance security, have additional affordability to maintain economic prosperity, have superior flexibility for the wide-ranging issues that we deal with, and then be able to adapt to a range of energy futures as we move forward. So I'm not reading word for word here, trying to characterize, but so we can keep moving. So just a couple of definitions to have us be thinking about today as we move forward. They're going to be important pieces that we're talking about. As noted, we're going to start with a series of presentations. I'm not going to read these word for word for you, but Tara Carmichael is a principal at Rocky Mountain Institute. My quick read of this is that she's a grid interactive zero energy building expert, and so I presume that's what she'll probably talk to us about. Again, you can look at these at your leisure. The next is Rebecca Kraft, who is an electrification expert with lots of rate design experience and has worked inside utilities as well, which is good, inside NL. She's with Sidewalk Labs, an advisor to them. Dan Egan is Senior Vice President of Sustainability and Utilities for Veredo. He comes at this with a real estate perspective, over 30 million square feet under management. So that's a really important perspective when we're talking about GEBS for sure. And then lastly is Ed Thomas. He's the Executive Director of Peak Load Management Alliance, which pretty much says what he's going to talk about. So I'm going to not belabor that at all and get us right into these speedy presentations, and I think therefore, Kara, you're up.
Oops. Excellent. Thanks, Scott. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for including me in the conversation today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So next slide, please. Great, so there are three things that I'd like to cover briefly with you guys today. Grid interactive efficient building, GEB, the definition and synergies with electrification efforts, GEB policy recommendations that are coming out of a GSA advisory committee task group that we were a part of, and then key findings on the value of GEB for GSA based on some research, some recent analysis that RMI has done. So first off, we totally agree with the DOE definition, and perhaps just to add a little bit more color to it, we see GEB as a co-optimization of 4 different building attributes. So energy efficiency, renewable energy, which we're pretty good at today, and then in addition, load flexibility and energy storage, which we're really just starting to better understand and harness at the building level. So a GEB strategy is really focused not only on energy use in terms of kilowatt hours, but also energy demand, and more specifically shaping the building's demand profile to save costs to the building owner as well as the utility. So next slide, please. So we see there are 3 key differentiators between our buildings today and what we need to move forward towards in the future. The first is interoperability and intelligence from building to grid. The second is this interoperability and intelligence across building level systems. And the third is load flexibility and demand focused optimization. So in the first, we need to shift towards a 2-way flow of information between buildings and the grid. In the second, we need to make sure that there's a central controls platform that can manage across building loads in a synchronized way so that we can optimize for different variables such as cost, carbon, reliability, et cetera. And then the third, we need to shift our focus from just managing energy and perhaps responding a couple of times a year to a demand response event to really having the capacity in buildings to shift and shed demand, not only in an instantaneous matter, but moving towards longer term shifting. Next slide. So GEBs carry great value today to both building owners and the grid. So for building owners, GEBs provide cost savings, and sometimes quite significantly, since demand charges can be more than half of utility costs for commercial building owners and operators. For the grid, 80% of grid peak is driven by buildings, and more than 10% of grid infrastructure costs are spent to meet that peak demand that occurs less than 1% of the time. So it's also worth noting that in New York State, there's some correlation between wholesale price and emissions, which is good, whereas in other parts of the country, like California, there's a gap that many utilities are struggling to rectify through rate structures. Next slide. Okay, so first off, a grid interactive building does not necessarily mean it's an all-electric building. However, that combination of an all-electric grid interactive building provides the lowest cost scenario to both building owners and the grid. So this is just a conceptual diagram that looks at kind of a conceptual 30-year costs in 3 different scenarios to both building owner and then to grid stakeholders. So under a business as usual scenario to the building owner, there's CapEx and OpEx to maintain a building. With an electric only conversion, there's going to be more CapEx than a business as usual scenario. And there's also going to be potentially higher OpEx. So under the all electric plus grid interactive building scenario, there will be a higher upfront cost to implement those, an all electric GEB solution, but that's going to provide much lower operating expenses, even as rates shift around or become more time of use based, since buildings will have the ability to shift demand to benefit owners under different rate scenarios. For the grid costs, the bar graphs on the right, similarly, there's a potentially significant CapEx cost to accommodate increased generation and transmission and distribution associated with increasing electric demand. And it'll also likely imply a shift in peak grid demand from late summer afternoon to winter morning, or an additional peak in the system. However, a grid interactive building could help avoid some of those major generation and T&D expansion and improvements, since it can hold demand to similar levels as we see today, while also enabling the grid to leverage more renewables. So an all-electric grid interactive building is able to shift the building's loads to when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing to maximize the use of low-cost renewables on the grid. So I haven't seen actual kind of numbers put to this combination of technologies, but I think it could be a worthwhile analysis. Okay, next slide, please. So the second topic I just wanted to share with the group was some work that was done by a task group under the General Services Administration Green Building Advisory Committee group. And so about a year ago now, we published 13 policy recommendations around grid interactive efficient buildings, and I'm just thinking it could be a good resource for this group. So next slide. So there were 3 main categories for these recommendations, and I'm just pulling kind of the highest priority recommendations from that. And it's worth noting that New York has a head start here, since there's already somewhat of a channel for distributed energy resources, that market created through the REV process. So of these high priority policy recommendations, I think the 3 that are most relevant are A1, B1, and C1. So A1 provides language for goal targets that are not only energy use intensity focused, but also demand focused. And since this has been done, several key efforts in the industry are actually leading in some metric creation around what a demand target could look like, including Lawrence Berkeley National Lab's Flex Lab work, as well as New Buildings Institute's Grid Optimal initiative. And I think New York already has an edge here as well with Local Law 97. So B2 encourages all new construction projects to have some level of load flexibility incorporated, and C1 requires more transparency around grid demand and emissions profiles, as well as grid needs. So next slide, the last data point that I wanted to share with you is RMI's key findings of a recent analysis on the value potential for GEB in the GSA portfolio. So really, what is GEB worth to building owners today? And this is the first study to look at it from that perspective. And what we found that there are 3 buckets of value to GSA and to building owners in general: the direct value, the indirect value, and then the societal value. So in the direct value, if GSA were to implement GEB across their entire 10,000 building portfolio, it would result in $50 million annual cost savings. And at the project level, our analysis showed a 30% on average savings with sub 4-year payback periods. It was a pretty powerful finding. Excuse me. The indirect value that GEB provide are increased leadership, better value on performance contracts, and improved control of buildings. And at the grid level, we found this could reduce grid T&D and generation by up to $70 million a year, with a demand reduction potential that GEB can provide that's twice as effective as the current demand response participation is providing. And all these findings are publicly available. So I guess to close, I think grid interactive efficient buildings can lower capital needs for both the transition to electrification and a low carbon electricity supply. GEB's lower cost for building owners in New York, even under today's rate structures. And I think in terms of those rate structures, time variable rates will help drive demand flexibility, which will help lower grid costs and emissions. So thank you.
Thank you, Kara. That was great. And for everybody that wants to hop in, we'll do that. We're going to go through the lightning rounds, and then this is all the fodder to get us talking. So, Rebecca, you're up now.
Okay. Sounds good. So, boy, I lived at a utility for 4 years ago, 4 years ago, and this discussion was going on then, and it's going on now, and it doesn't seem like it's progressed much. I think with the climate crisis really coming to finally to a fore in people's minds, maybe it will. I'm going to talk about electrification really in the context of a project that Sidewalk Lab is trying to do in Toronto, which will not be a net zero, it will be climate positive. It will also be affordable. So we've been thinking about how do you make a fully electrified grid affordable, which is a big deal when you think about electrification and its potential to double demand. So we think there are three main components. Greening energy sources, obviously, is a big one, but this means all non-fossil resources, something Greg mentioned earlier. It's solar, it's battery storage, it's wind, but it's also using waste heat recovery, anaerobic digestion, thermal resources, heat pumps. It's thinking about the non-fossil side of power in a holistic way, and also thinking about it with electricity, thinking about how you manage the two together. The second piece is reducing demand. Super efficient buildings are one. Looking in the Toronto proposal we submitted, we're looking at passive house inspired tall timber buildings, and that alone makes a huge reduction in demand and energy use. It also means a little less infrastructure, hopefully, in the long run, something that Carol mentioned. We also think it's really important to have dynamic pricing. I'll get to this in a minute. And the third piece is to optimize energy use, and that has a couple of components. First, it's really, really important, particularly thinking commercial buildings, to weed out the electricity use that no one cares about, and it actually degrades comfort, overheating in the winter, overcooling in the summer, overcooling in the winter. But it's important to do these three things together. On the residential side, we think that probably one of the most important things one can do, on the commercial side as well, is have real-time dynamic rates. And they really don't exist now, and there's some of these structures out there. And actually, I want to digress a minute. I am not a rate expert. I play one on TV. Bill might know that, but I certainly don't have a lot of ideas about rates. And finally got to a place where people were willing to listen. And I'm not sure that's good or bad, but we'll find out. Some of these rates that exist, Even the real-time rate studies that don't really include all of the charges that are embodied in a rate. And we think that it's important to have a real-time rate, an hourly rate, a sub-hourly rate that includes all charges. So you actually have a really meaningful difference between a peak price and an off-peak price. And clearly, when carbon is concerned, that makes a lot more difference in a place where carbon and price are highly correlated. In Canada, where we're looking at this project, that is the case. In New York, it's somewhat the case. It's not as true other places, but because we don't really have a good sense when carbon is on the grid at a micro level at any given time, it's really hard to know if it's valuable in all places. But we also think that people can't be expected to pay attention to energy all the time. They don't want to get people to reduce small energy and small increments is difficult, as we all know. Even to do things that make economic sense is difficult. So we think that demand management has to happen automatically and continuously. And information provided and options provided, but you have to make it simple. We think this is true on the commercial space as well. And we also think that you have to incorporate renewables and storage early and make that simple and make it available. In Toronto, we're looking at a way to have people subscribe to shares of on-site solar and storage on a fixed cost basis so they can mitigate price increases, but also so they can partake more in a green outlook, which is hard to do in multifamily buildings, easier to do in other places. Finally, we think that bills have to be transparent, they have to be understandable, and they have to be provided, or information on the bill has to be provided on a regular basis, like daily or hourly, so you know where you are and you can plan accordingly. So we're going to test this. We actually got an opportunity to test these ideas, which is a beginning to what we're trying to do in Toronto. We're going to do this in Ontario with a smaller utility. And in that test, we're going to have a real-time rate, which we're building now, where all generation, transmission, and distribution costs will be built into the hourly rate. It's going to move every hour based on the Ontario market price, but also demand on the grid at that hour. We're going to control hopefully 80% of the demand in the home with a bunch of different technologies. And we're going to control that demand based on the residents' desired budget and comfort level. So they can tell us that early and often, and the adjustments to demand and to end use will come automatically over time. With an opportunity to opt out, but the idea is to make it seamless and easy. We're also going to model some solar and storage so we can offer theoretical shares of that to see if there is customer engagement around that, and to see how much that will actually mitigate bills and mitigate price increases. And finally, we're going to have an e-bill that will be available every hour to show where you are at that hour and to show what the cost of opting out of an energy management plan would be for that hour or for a larger amount of time. On the commercial side, similar kinds of problems. Studies show that the buildings use energy, way more energy than their code compliance model, and that energy use varies widely between buildings, even though the rate age and ratings may be the same. We also know that tenants drive a lot of this use, and they don't have a lot of opportunity to control temperature, hot water, lighting, plug loads. No one's looking, and no one's controlling. And finally, we think that most equipment is run with a set it and leave it approach, where loads can change things. Often there are lease structures that prohibit efficient changes for optimization and efficiency, and tenants can't really get what they want when they want it. So as on the residential side, we think that first studying and then automating a lot of this opportunity is critical. So tenants don't have to pay attention to energy demand when that's not their business. But we think building automation has to really provide information needed in the moment to plan for the right outcomes in the next moment and beyond. And that has to shift over time and learn over time. It also has to be that the systems that do this has to be kind of open source, modular, and replicable. Otherwise, it's way, way too expensive to do this kind of thing on a one-off. Also on the commercial side, I think it's really important to come up with a different kind of building code. We know that energy benchmarking is moving in the right direction, but it's certainly not perfect, nor are the measures that are around today, EUI, kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour. They're good, but they don't really account for occupancy, and they don't really account for dynamic carbon intensity of the grid. So we think it's really important to move toward measuring occupancy and seeing what the true impact is on energy use and demand. And we think that it's important to, at the same time, figure out how to get a grid intensity measure for at lower than their main transmission level. In New York, you can kind of find that out at the NISO level. We're looking hopefully to find that out at a smaller level, like Zone J, for example, so we can actually see what's going on. And we're interested, we started to, and we're interested in doing more of this, which is adding occupancy counters to dozens of new buildings in New York to better understand the relationship between energy and occupancy. And we're exploring the grid size of the NISO right now. And then let me talk about some more about what we're doing in Toronto. It has all the components I mentioned before about the rate. We have proposed there a thermal grid, partial geo exchange, waste heat recovery, that design change. The idea is that we would control both the resources, on-site solar, on-site storage, all of demand and end use, together with the thermal grid in sync, so that we can produce an optimized outcome, both to reduce bills and to reduce demand. And when we modeled this, the demand, business as usual demand for that 3 million square foot development, about 5.5 megawatts without electrification. If you electrified everything kind of in a business as usual way, that demand goes up to over 11 megawatts. The passive buildings take that down quite a number. The thermal grid, and there's not going to be any natural gas at the development, so that drops the demand the most. And by the time we factored in energy end use, we were down at 5.3 megawatts. So that's a big change. That's a lot of embodied carbon you don't have to face by increasing the size of the grid. And it's a lot of carbon, and in Toronto, where most gas is on the grid during peak, it makes a massive difference on not just megawatt hours. And that's it. Thanks.
Rebecca, thank you. Now we're ready for Dan. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Good morning. If we can advance to not the second. This is an introductory slide. I think I'll dial in my first ditto comment for the sake of efficiency. I think we've gone through the overview of the regulations, so you can advance to the next slide. Thank you for having me this morning. Happy to be representing the real estate industry in this conversation, or at least in the lightning round. Have plenty to say for this afternoon when we talk about what's happening inside the building and how there's a lot of solutions there and challenges that fall within the purview of this discussion. But talking about this morning's topic, I think I will say the real estate community, there are many motivated leaders in New York City who are advancing decarbonization goals, have been prior to this law, to both of these laws, and are looking to continue doing such. But I think that where we are right now is forcing real estate companies to take pause while some of the uncertainties about these policies are determined. So this slide just sort of highlights 4 of the largest uncertainties as I see it, and as it pertains to the grid. The first being the future rate of carbon intensity for electricity and where that's delivered. So we've had a lot of conversations about geography and how those different regions are interactive with one another in the grid. I've personally had many conversations at a federal level talking about how New York ISO's sort of geopolitical boundary is unique in this country, in that we have the ability to control the state's energy planning and sort of within a coterminous boundary with the state itself. The ability for end users to purchase renewable energy certificates is critical at this time. I think it's been elevated in light of the Climate Mobilization Act. However, good corporate citizens have been hoping to more locally source their renewable supply and have not been able to do so according to GHG protocol. So possessing the REC is a very important priority for many real estate owners who have been pursuing decarbonization efforts prior to and through this current landscape. The carbon coefficient for natural gas used for cogeneration is very important. Many large real estate companies, in the not too distant past, spent quite a bit of money on cogeneration, which was celebrated here in New York State and partially underwritten by NYSERDA. I think there's some uncertainty going forward with how such technology will be valued as part of this electrification process. And then finally, city and state policies concerning Con Edison steam. That seems to be the unmentioned utility here in this conversation. We understand that steam is not renewable or carbon-free. However, it provides much value in terms of resilience, and larger customers who have quite a commitment from a physical infrastructure to steam need some more confident signals going forward with how to plan accordingly, particularly in the conversation of transitioning to all electric services. I think that we value electrification, and we understand that in an environment where the electric grid is truly carbon-free and sourced renewably, that to have an all-electric building solves a lot of problems. I appreciate Greg's comments in the beginning talking about existing buildings and the challenges with doing this sort of in a phased approach with gradual capital planning. I think with some data-driven solutions and certainties, the real estate community can probably move forward with a little more confidence. There's major capital decisions sort of waiting in the rafters depending on how the details of both city and state policy are determined. This just discusses some data solutions. I borrowed an image from one of my favorite annual publications, the Power Trends Report from New York ISO. I can't focus enough on the carbon coefficient of electricity. We know what it will be through 2025 here in the city. We don't know what it will be past that. I understood I'm sitting here in the PSB office, and this is not a city agency, but I can't stress enough to open up the communication lines between the two so that one agency understands what the other is working on. We've had a lot of conversations about where to draw the boundary around the sort of relevant zone of electrical generation. We really appreciate the notion of the Climate Mobilization Act that one must narrowly define renewable power in order to truly start to decarbonize the electricity that's generated here in New York City. However, I think we need to understand if there are opportunities beyond a very short list of transmission projects that will actually further progress towards decarbonizing electricity in New York City. Vornado, I think over 80% of our assets are here in New York City. Our stakeholder group are New York residents and employees. It's really important to us that the public health and environmental benefits of a cleaner grid is realized here in New York. However, we have an opportunity to be an active and influential participant in that, but without knowing some greater detail or perhaps having a broader opportunity to participate, we may miss that sort of partnership that could happen. The kind of concept combines both point one and point two. I think in addition to the CLCPA's goals, we need to understand what the metric will be in order to measure progress going forward. We've been pointed towards the e-grid carbon emissions rate for New York City Westchester's zone as defined in the Climate Mobilization Act. However, speaking with EGRID, division of the EPA, EGRID is done every 2 years. It is a look back on reported generation. The number in CMA is EGRID 2016. CMA's rulemaking will come out in 2023. The EGRID value that will be available for New York City Westchester at that time will only reflect conditions in 2020. And all we know about 2020 is the closure of Indian Point plant, which will add, we understand, which will be supplemented with more natural gas. So if we are to use the coefficient of electricity as our indicative number to motivate or deter us from electrification, we're not going to have a very good number to look at in 2023 when rulemaking is completed for CMA. We also don't understand how transmission improvements will improve the coefficient downstate. We fully understand this tale of two grids. I pulled that image, as I said, from Power Trends. So, part of the solution, in addition to generation, should be these transmission improvements. How does transmission improvements widen the bottleneck between upstate and down? Does that accomplish something towards greening the grid here downstate? We don't understand that yet. And so we have a very informed group in real estate who appreciates the data and looks forward to being part of that conversation. The future carbon coefficient for gas used for cogeneration, I think, also helps us with longer-term capital planning. Needless to say, the community or industry is very trigger-shy about new cogen. However, you have a sort of fleet of DER in existing buildings that can be active participants in sort of this transition to a greener grid. We understand that electrification will put a short-term burden on the grid and that the availability of existing DER to offset that constraint should not be discounted. And then finally, Con Edison team, we're sort of rallying behind a plan of decarbonizing the electric grid. Why have we not had a conversation with Con Ed's team that could motivate them to have their own goal going forward? There are opportunities there to make steam less fossil fuel intensive. I certainly don't play an engineer on TV or in person, so leave that solution up to the more informed group, but I think we should not leave Con Edison's team out of this conversation, as it serves a very valuable purpose towards this transition that we're planning. And if we just go to the last slide, I've included some of my additional resources. New York Energy Consumers Council is an organization here that advocates for the ratepayer. We did complete a study to look at the relationship between electrification and the cost of electricity for ratepayers. I encourage everybody to take a look. The US EPA last year released a very compelling report that talks about the societal benefits of renewable energy and energy efficiency. I think it's super important to continue to assess the social impact of all of this great work that we're doing, and this is one of a study that establishes that tie. And of course, a plug for some of my favorite reports from New York ISO. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. Ed Thomas, why don't you hop on and take over?
I will. Hey, thanks for helping, giving me an opportunity to help jumpstart this conversation. Next slide. Plma is a nonprofit trade association, 160 members, including some folks New York-based there, Con Ed, Orange and Rockland, Central Hudson, NYPA, and Energy Hub. So we're not normally seen as a policy advocacy group, but today I'm going to speak to you as kind of that voice of load management practitioners to just reiterate a little bit of ditto here. But next slide. We like the fact that you're really taking this holistic approach, that including demand response along with energy efficiency and storage, and that just want to validate kind of that perspective. Next slide. And to kind of build on maybe what Carol and some others were alluding to, if you can continue to build this, I guess. maybe next slide and then to the next one. What we've seen is really this evolution from demand response being these one-way communication load control systems or interruptible rates, moving more towards with two-way and with integration of demand distributed energy resources to become kind of more of this evolution, and it's in various stages in various parts of the country. And it's not necessarily limited, by technology, and some of this has happened perhaps in spite of technology, but it really has been about, how this has evolved around the country and what's happening. Next slide. And I think, but with that, we've seen peak load kind of go from 10 hours a year, or maybe, water air switches in the summer, or water heater switches in the winter, and moving more towards, as I think Kara alluded to, is this idea of flexibility in load management. So we're now, building on this with the potential for grid interactive buildings to be not just 10 hours a year, but maybe 10 minutes a day to be able to adjust load and truly shape load in ways that we just couldn't before, thanks to technology. Next slide. So, with all of that, the key points really want to leave, the key takeaways, from our practitioner perspective is in your policy considerations and making that actionable is acknowledging that there's this integrated approach that's happening around the country that you need to continue to encourage and get out of our silos of excellence around some of these things and more toward that integrated approach, and encouraging flexibility and load management strategies that are going to, in some cases, clip the peak, and in other cases, perhaps fill the valley, making it, in some cases, to increase energy usage by encouraging that kind of flexible load management overall for the benefit of the grid and for the overall benefit of the customers and decarbonizing for the environment. The third point there is really about, it's not just about getting the prices right. It's not just about waiting for the right technology. I think we've also seen some behavioral approaches around the country that really, it's both the pricing and the behavioral, as well as these embedded appliance controls, but also the systems that Rebecca talked about, and that approach of being able to take the truly two-way embedded system approaches as well, but you can do that. It's not an either or. It's a real complementary approach, and so. But because, and I say that from the perspective of leveraging some of the best practices we've seen from leading practitioners around the country. Rebecca talked about what's going on in Toronto. There's some incredible pricing things going on up there in Electra utilities. New Brunswick Power's done some incredible things around that. Just to speak to that. If we're talking about grid interactive buildings, what they've done in California with Title 24 to mandate that new construction be open ADR compliant, a lot of things going on there. So next slide is, I just want to, before you start thinking about piloting everything and maybe deploying nothing, I just want to caution you that there's a lot of folks doing a lot of neat stuff out there that you can leverage. We like to say the pioneers get the arrows and the settlers get the land, and the fact that there's a lot of publications that we put out, conferences we do twice a year, where folks talk about what's actually happening out there and the way the world is, maybe not the way the world should be. And so with that, I hope that, like to contribute to the discussion and turn the microphone back to all of you in the audience. So thank you for the opportunity to join you today.